I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear a chapter of my ongoing sword and sorcery serial. Each week, without fail, I write a brand new chapter, and then I record it in one single, flawless take. It picks up right where the last episode left off. So if this is your first one, and you want to know all the backstory, you might want to start at the beginning. Otherwise, feel free to dive in right here and figure it out as you go. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 31. They had made excellent time, astounding time. Through that brief 4-hour day, in the dim light of that insufficient sun, they had exceeded all of her expectations. And now, with that useless, traitorous sun retreating beyond the horizon, she watched as the sorcerer and his war party marched forward. Marched dutifully, triumphantly through the blasted tundra, made their way across that barren wasteland, drawing ever closer to the tower, to her tower. She grinned and thought about what the past 4 hours must have held. If she squinted, she could see the carnage that lay behind the liberators, and if she thought on it hard enough, she could smell it. She could smell the singed hair, the bubbling, bloated flesh, green skin blackened and charred, and she could hear the screams, those wonderful, agonizing screams as the trolls met their end. By fire, by steel, by a boot on the neck, they met their end and were cast into that inky black void of nothingness. She felt rested. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt truly rested. But not only rested, she was invigorated, excited by the coming of those brave souls, there to help her break the siege of her tower. She was rested. But what of them? What of the sorcerer and his war party? Presumably they had slept some. They would have had to. 24 hours spent marching through that rocky terrain, casting death down upon the trolls. 24 hours at the very least, as she had no way of knowing how long they had marched before she caught sight of them. They must have rested, even if they took naps in shifts as the group continued on. Otherwise, there was no way they could keep up that pace unless the sorcerer had some means of imparting additional vitality. It was beyond her abilities, far beyond what she had been taught before losing her master. But it was not impossible. Perhaps that sorcerer wielded some ancient knowledge, forgotten spells, gifts from their ancestors, passed down to fight off the rising tide of hate and ignorance. Perhaps the explanation was even simpler. Perhaps the party was fueled by pure adrenaline. She saw no heavy packs of food. She saw only a few canteens of water. Perhaps that was all that the sorcerer and his valiant warriors ran on. Whatever they ran on, now they ran. Where before they had walked steadily, taking time to mete out the sorcerer's cleansing fire, to fill the troll's caverns with hungry flame, now they ran, sprinting toward the tower, flinging themselves recklessly through the tundra. She set her jaw, and she nodded. She would have made the same decision. Presumably, they could have stood and fought, set up a perimeter and defended it through the night, keeping the trolls at bay with fire and steel. But they were so close. They had come so close. A few hours of sprinting could easily bring them to the tower, to safety, to liberation. Whatever they chose, though, there was no time for rest, and there would be none for the next 20 hours, because the sun, the one that made a mockery of its duties, that cowardly sun, was setting. She was shocked at how quickly they had moved, at how far they had traveled during a mere 4-hour day. But more than anything, she was delighted, thrilled, ecstatic that soon enough, moving at the rate they were, the sorcerer and his war party would be close enough for her to lend them her aid. To lend them that aid, however, to help them in their trek across the tundra, she couldn't just stand there gaping happily. No, she had work to do. With a glee, an eagerness, a willingness that she hadn't known in ages, she set about her duties, performing the same tasks that she did every night. But now, instead of being driven by a trudging obligation, she was fueled by the joy of the imminently victorious, urged on by an inescapable triumph, buoyed with the knowledge that, as unlikely as it had once seemed, righteousness would win out in the end. She prepared her cauldrons, heavy with that ravenous liquid flame. She retrieved some simple sustenance from the pantry, and she returned to the window. She had hoped, perhaps vainly, that the sorcerer and his warriors had purged the tundra of opposition. Foolishly, she had dreamed that the trolls' caves were all connected, a warren of filthy, crawling tunnels. She had prayed to all the gods, holy and unholy, that the flames would cascade through the burrows, immolating the nescient beasts by the hundreds, by the thousands. But that hope was indeed in vain. The tundra was too vast, the tunnels too labyrinthine, the trolls too numerous, and their churning, hateful ignorance too powerful. The sorcerer and his war party ran, but the wasteland lit up around them as dark, ominous tunnels filled with glowing green eyes. Her heart was beating out of her chest. She could feel it fill with passion, with joy, with fury. She could feel it pound against her ribcage. Every part of her body quivered, shook, and raged as she fought back that desire to act, to strike, to summon up that cathartic, hungry flame and send it raining down upon the tundra, to pick up where the sorcerer had left off, to boil the trolls into a noxious soup before they could even leave their caves. But she didn't. No. It was too soon. It was too early. There were hours yet to go. Hours until the party would reach the tower. And even then, what good was getting them there if she was unable to hold her position, unable to repel the troll's nightly volley against the tower, her tower, against all that remained of a once great world, a once powerful civilization, a realm that had put all others to shame under the guidance of the brave, the strong, and the powerful. She restrained herself. She kept her urges in check for as long as she could, but when those lumpy, cretinous heads began to rise from their caves, she could wait no longer. With a joyous cry, she raised her hands, and the flames leapt to obey. They filled her chambers. They devoured all they touched. They swirled about her as she laughed, ready to finally taste triumph, to savor victory. They consumed the tower. They lit it up, a beacon in that dying world. And when she was ready, she pushed her hands forward. The flames leapt from the tower, rocketing through the night sky, causing the braver trolls to look up. and the more cowardly to shield their eyes. She pushed as hard as she could. She used every bit of strength she had. She hoped to shield the sorcerer and his warriors during their run, to protect them as they made for the tower. But it was no use. She wasn't strong enough. She had acted too rashly, and they were too far away. A pulsing ball of fire smashed into the earth, lighting up a swath of land between the tower and its liberators. She couldn't reach them. She couldn't reach the trolls that were already striking, attempting to break through the ring of brave men and women that protected the sorcerer, that cunning magician who, even as he ran, flung flame into the gaping mouths of countless caves. She couldn't reach them. Not consistently. Not yet, at least. But that didn't mean she couldn't help. She cast flame from the tower with both hands, sweat beading up on her brow, her arms aching with the force she used to send the fire out into the darkness. She couldn't protect them from attack. That job fell to the sorcerer himself and those sworn to guard him. But she would rather be damned than stand there useless. So she threw her flame, not at the trolls around the war party, but at the ground before them, at the rocky, craggy earth that lay between them and their salvation, the tower. Her tower. She cast hotter flame in more quantities at a faster speed than she had ever dared to attempt. She used everything. She gave everything. She blasted the earth with such force that rock and rubble was launched into the sky, that the filth-filled caves of the trolls were cracked open and exposed to the flame-filled air. She would do all that she could. She would give everything, anything to help them, to protect their passage, their run, their flight, do anything to see the trolls burn away to nothing, their bones charred to ash that blew away in that blazing, infernal wind. She summoned up flame and sent it careening out into the wasteland, but all the while, she kept an eye on the sorcerer. They had slowed. They couldn't keep up that pace forever, not once the sun had fully set, once the trolls were emboldened enough to leave their caves. Their progress had slowed to a crawl. The warriors had closed ranks around the sorcerer, but still they moved forward, ever forward, and she cast down hungry fire to clear the way for them. For the first time since awakening, doubt began to creep into her heart as she watched a warrior, a girl no older than she was, watched as she was struck down. Her gleaming armor, her swinging sword, the one that moved lightning fast through the darkness, her clever, agile movements, her massive, worn but sturdy shield, they all meant nothing in the face of a simple fist to the head. They were surrounded. They couldn't fight them all off, and in attacking one troll, she had exposed her flank. Nothing drastic, but just enough. Enough for that imbecilic monster to shoot its fist forward. Standing in her tower, she gasped, and though she knew it was impossible, she could feel the crack as the troll's massive, meaty fist collided with the girl's skull. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough to stagger her. She wavered for but a moment was all the trolls needed, and before she could right herself, another was upon her, and another climbed over the two, and another pushed the third aside, and another fought for positioning with the fourth. The circle was broken, their position compromised, the sorcerer exposed, and all hell broke loose. Back in the tower, She worked as feverishly as ever, tears welling up in her eyes as she threw flame after flame out into the tundra, hoping, wishing, praying that if she did enough, if she killed enough, if she roasted enough of those filthy monsters, if she burned enough to the ground, that there was a chance, ever so slight, an infinitesimal chance, that she could save them. But she couldn't. And she didn't. She watched in abject horror as it happened. She dropped her hands to her side as she realized that it was over. They still stood, but not for long. The sorcerer went down quickly, not because of any plan or tactics on the part of the trolls, but simply because he couldn't defend himself. Not in close quarters, not against the unconquerable numbers of trolls that continued to pour from the darkness at impossible rates. With the circle broken, they were all surrounded, hedged in on all sides, and with the sorcerer gone, there was nothing left to fight for. Even if she had been able to help, been able to convince herself to do something, anything, it would have been no use. Even if her flames could reach the skirmish, they would have devoured trolls and warriors alike. But perhaps that would have been a better death, a cleaner death than the one that befell those brave, doomed souls. Tears streamed down her soot-covered face, and she screamed in agony, in pain, in frustration, and in failure. Screamed as she watched the final warrior, a stout, severe man, beard stained with blood, watched as he swung his axe in wide arcs. She could tell from the tower that it was over, that it was finished, that he had no chance. And she was certain that he knew it too. Knew it even before the trolls piled on top of him, hiding his sad end from her tear-filled eyes. She reached out her hands, grasping the windowsill, attempting to steady herself. But it was no use. She crumpled to the floor in a sobbing, heaving heap, her tears falling to the stones below as she howled out curses that she had sworn to never use. Why had she been so cowardly? She should have marched out into the tundra herself. Creeping green sickness be damned. She should have helped them. With another sorcerer, they would have had a chance, at the very least, a chance to make it to the tower. And the creeping green sickness, the sorcerer could have healed her, could have helped her. It would have all been okay. For the first time, everything would have been okay. But now, nothing was okay. They had failed, and she had allowed them to fail. She had failed them, and now they were dead. She had used everything at her disposal. She had used everything in the two cauldrons. The heavy cast iron pot swung nearly empty, as useless as that dim sun, as useless as she was. And for what? For what? The sorcerer, his war party. They were as dead as if she had done nothing. Nothing. She cried out and gnashed her teeth. She fought against the urge to crawl back into bed, to wait for the inevitable, to give up and allow her destiny to unfold, unhindered. She pounded her fists into the floor, into those heavy stones, smoothed by millennia of use, and she wailed loud enough and long enough that she didn't hear the sound of ringing bells. Maul, Skog, and Xylan snuck into the city under cover of night. They had been running for days, ever since taking their leave of Cliffholm. snatching bits of sleep in the night before rising and running again in the light of that border realm's waxing moon. They smelled horrible. From sweat, from mud, from desperation, and most of all, from the loathsome, abhorrent, corrupting touch of that thing. The sweat, the mud, the desperation, those they had grown accustomed to. There was no getting used to the unimaginably repugnant stench that still assaulted their nostrils, the stench of the Feldrun. Hunted by so many, the High Elves, the Fera, that thing, the Feldrun. And so conspicuous in his reeking halfling leathers, it would have been suicide to walk Maul in through the metropolis's carefully guarded gates. So instead, they visited one of the merchants that crowded outside the city walls. They visited a merchant who thought the city's taxes too high and thought himself capable of protecting his own goods. And they taught him the folly of both notions. Wearing new, clean clothing and nourished from the merchant's personal larder, Maul and Xylan sent the massive cat beast SKALD scrambling up a quiet stretch of the city wall with one end of a light, strong, newly acquired rope clenched in her vice-like jaws. Then, counting themselves lucky for the clouds obscuring what would have been a full moon, they scaled the wall, dropped down quietly, undetected, and found themselves in the city of Ravena. Ravena held the College of Dreams, where Maul had hoped to use Traum's soulstone to bargain for passage to the realm of men, to his home, to the throne, to his throne. But after shoving the gleaming stone in that gaping maw, after transferring Traum's soul to the stone god, after leaving him to fight off that thing, Maul had lost all of his leverage. Still, the godless monk Xylan, in between his spontaneous, disconcerting bursts of laughter, promised that a way across the sundered world still remained in that gleaming, bustling city, the biggest that the savage brute Maul had ever laid his eyes upon. Maul didn't like placing his fate in anyone's hands, much less in those of the giggling, wild-eyed Xylan, the godless monk who had been left changed by the halfling witch doctor's procedures. But with no other choices, Maul allowed Xylan to swear him to silence as they went to meet with his only option. Xylan, I'd say you looked good, but you always could spot a liar. The old man laughed until his mirth shifted into a cough that rattled his lungs, no doubt irritated by the smoke that hung thick in that dark, dusty tavern. Henno. Xylan chuckled as he took a seat across from the man and gestured for Maul to do the same. Maul sat down warily, still irritated that Xylan made him leave Skog outside. Not because he was scared of the tavern. He was sure he could rip any and all of these weak, soft city dwellers limb from quivering limb. But rather, because he didn't like anyone telling him what he couldn't do. Xylan accepted the pipe Henno offered him, drew upon it slowly, and exhaled as he spoke. We need safe passage. I can have you on a boat in 2 hours. It will cost you. No. Xylan stopped him. We need to go further. Much further than that. A broad, twisted smile crept across Henno's face, and as he leaned in, drawing closer to the sputtering lamp perched upon the table, Maul got a better look at the man. His head was completely bald, no stubble, so it clearly wasn't a choice. But what he lacked in hair atop his head, he more than made up for on his chin, which boasted a long, twisting black beard flecked heavily with gray. But as impressive as his beard was, the most striking thing about Henno was his face and the angry purple birthmark that crawled across it. Xylan, my boy. Henno began to laugh again, but checked himself to prevent another coughing fit. I knew you'd one day regret pawning that silly idol. Have the monks finally caught up with you? No. This is something else. Xylan nodded at Maul. We need to get to the realm of men. The sharp intake of breath, Henno began to shake his head. Another realm. Sure. The Sundered Worlds are filled with barrier realms. It's as easy as rowing between islands in a stream. But a major realm, the realm of men. Maul broke his promise to Xylan, and he growled. What do you require? Magics I don't have. Power I don't possess. Henno smiled. But that I would love to. Maul pounded his fist on the table. If the Dark Tavern wasn't so familiar with angry drunks and their antics, it might have even drawn some attention. Speak plainly. Tell us what you want so we can get it and be done with this foolishness. Henno turned to Xylan, speaking in a low, serious voice. You'd be smart to keep the brute in check. Ravna's no place for a wild animal. Xylan put his hand out to calm Maul, and he laughed. No? Then how do you manage to do so well here? Henno grinned and pointed at his birthmark. Born lucky, I guess. If you two want to get to the realm of men, I can do it. I won't be able to bring you back, but I can sure as hell send you there. I could cast the spell easy, but I don't know it. Henno pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and scrawled an address upon it with a bit of charcoal. Go here, break in quietly, and steal the grimoire you find there. It's bound in red leather, and it's lighter than it looks. The old fool is arrogant enough that he rarely even locks it up. Xylan looked at the address and frowned as Maul growled again. Why don't you do it yourself? You mean aside from the fact that then it would be you who were in my debt? Henno leaned back and lit his pipe once again. Look at me. I'm not the young man I used to be. Much the pity. And I'm neither quiet nor fast enough to steal the book myself. Xylan folded the paper and hid it within his robes, laughing. I'm impressed that you can spin even your decrepitude to your advantage. Henno scowled. You didn't used to laugh so much. As for me, I'll be impressed when you return with my grimoire. Go quickly, while the clouds still hang in your favor. You don't want that old wizard catching sight of you. That's the last thing you want. Skog drew stares on the street, but given the hour, there weren't many people out to give them. Besides, in a city like Ravenna, with roads, ports, magics, and who knows what else leading in and out, exotic beasts were nothing too far out of the ordinary. When they reached the address, the one that Henno had scrawled out for them, Maul wanted to simply kick the door down. He had fought hand to hand, had struggled with that thing, with the Feldrun. So he would not be intimidated or frightened of some city-bred wizard. But Xylan was able to convince him that in this case, the solution wasn't directness. It was expedience. For the sake of argument, Xylan agreed with the savage that even the wizard's most powerful spells couldn't heal a broken skull. But he went on to remind Maul that they didn't just want to escape the realm. They wanted to do so quickly. Though Maul insisted that it wouldn't take long to beat the breath from some magical nebbish, he reluctantly agreed that slipping in, stealing the grimoire, then slipping back out would still be faster. So that's exactly what they did. Keeping careful watch, they crept around to the back of the well-constructed but humble two-story home. To Maul's chagrin, Xylan once again kept him from putting his considerable brute strength to use, and instead opened the back door quickly, and most importantly, quietly, with a long, twisted bit of metal he produced from somewhere within his robes. As they crept inside, all three, Maul, Xylan, and even Skog, stepped carefully, struggling not to make a single sound as they made their way through the darkness. Though they had helped them break into the house undetected, now the heavy clouds worked against them, as away from Ravenna's street lamps they found themselves lost in the darkness of an unknown room. "Careful," Xylan hissed. "Stay where you are. Let me look. I'm quieter." Maul hated taking orders, but he knew that the monk was right. Stealth wasn't one of his strong suits, so the savage communicated agreement and distaste simultaneously in the only way he knew how. He grunted. As Xylan moved silently through the building's first floor, searching for that red grimoire, Maul stood motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. When they did, he found himself in a plain room with wooden furniture, but upon every surface laid stacks of notes, covered in runes, glyphs, and sigils that meant nothing to his primitive brain. Just looking at the papers made him feel stupid, ignorant, useless, and he felt the rage begin to boil up within him. But before Maul could do anything, before he could even decide what it was that he wanted to do, he heard an unmistakable sound coming from an adjacent room. It was Xylan, and he was laughing. As quickly as he could while still staying silent, Maul rushed ahead as Skog padded stealthily along by his side. The room, the one that housed the building's front door, was noticeably brighter than the rest of the house. The clouds had begun parting, and the full moon's rays had stretched into the building through a wide, curtainless window. And before that window stood Xylan, looking out, motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, the convulsion of a man trying his damnedest not to break out into fits of laughter. "You giggling fool! You're going to get us caught!" Maul whispered and lunged forward, but before he could reach Xylan, the godless monk collapsed and began shaking wildly as a deep, caustic laugh started in his gut, climbed up through his body, exited through his mouth, and reverberated throughout the house. Maul dropped down to Xylan's side as he heard a series of thumps and a steady creaking coming from the ceiling. Footsteps. For all his talk of expedience, that stupid, useless monk had awakened the wizard, and now Maul would end up fighting him anyway. In the now glaring light of the full moon, Maul could see that Xylan lay face down, shoulders hunched up around his ears. If Maul had to kill this wizard to get his book, so be it. But he would make Xylan, the one who had drawn his attention. Maul would force the monk to help him. "Stop it! Stop it!" Maul growled, no longer even trying to keep his voice low, as he took Xylan's shoulder and began to turn him over. "What are you laughing at?" But when he rolled Xylan over, Maul was taken aback. This man, who had seen things that should never be seen, who had traversed the sundered worlds, who had traveled through the roiling underneath, who had slaughtered mythical beasts and wrestled with that thing, the Feldrun. This man was left speechless. Because when he turned Xylan over, Maul saw that his companion, the godless monk, was changed. His nose grayed and pulled out, his ears enlarged and lifted to the top of his head, his face covered with yellow fur, spotted with black, his eyes as dark as his humor, and that mouth, that awful, gaping, toothy maw, hanging open with that thick, horrible pink tongue lolling out obscenely. Xylan cackled loudly. And for the first time, the laughter matched the body that emitted it, the body of a grinning, sardonic scavenger. "What am I laughing at?" He drew his lips back in a smile more terrible than any sneer. "Everything." If you're digging SKALD, please leave a good review on iTunes. It helps other people find the podcast, and if you leave a good one, I'll read it on the show. Sam the Plant says, "It's a fun time, and the story has kept me listening." Recently, due to an appearance on the awesome fantasy fiction podcast and all the new listeners it brought in, I had to up the bandwidth ceiling on SKALD. This is great news because it means that people are enjoying what I'm doing and that the audience is growing. But it also means something else. SKALD just got about twice as expensive to produce. If you dig the show, if you want to keep it coming out every week, please head over to patreon.com/SKALD and pledge a few bucks each month. Until that massive movie option comes through, and you know it's coming, SKALD is completely fan-supported, so I need your help. I would love to hear from you on social media. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Username, Aubrey Sitterson. Or hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, the SKALD ebook, still just $2.99 on Amazon, buy, my comics writing, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. Brace yourself for another music recommendation. I know you like SKALD. You've made it this far. So presumably, you'd also like other heavy, brutal stuff. If so, you owe it to yourself to check out Black Breath's newest, Slaves Beyond Death. It's ostensibly death metal, I guess. I'm not really clear on the distinctions, but it's got a lot of hardcore punk and thrash metal influences, which means brutal breakdowns and recognizable riffs to go with all those nasty vocals. If you don't like it at first, give it some time. I think it'll grow on you. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.